All right. Good afternoon and good evening to everyone. We're so excited to have you join us today. As you are trickling in, please make sure to sign into or use the chat box to introduce yourselves. We're going to give everyone about a minute or so to log in. And again, as you are trickling in, please make sure to use the chat box to intro yourselves. Hey, hey, yeah. Oh, yeah, 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 yeah. I'm taking my freedom, putting it on the shelf, putting it on the chain, wearing it round my neck. I'm taking my freedom, putting it in my car. Wherever I choose to go, it won't take me far. All right. Good evening, good afternoon to everyone who is joining us today. We're so excited to have you join us for our All Raise event, Just Work, Get Shit Done, Fast and Fair. So I am Marian. So welcome to everyone. Welcome from All Raise. I'm Marian Arake. And before we get started, I just want to wish all the amazing women on this call a happy and well-deserved International Women's Day. We're excited to be celebrating this day with you all. And before we jump in, I'm just going to go through a few housekeeping items. Just for all of you to know, there are two webinar features I want you to keep in mind. As you are trickling in, please feel free to use the chat function to introduce yourself to others on the call. We always like to see where you're from, who you are. And when you have questions throughout our sessions today, please drop your questions into the Q&A box. That will help us keep track of all the questions and hopefully we can get to them. And so as you all know, this will be recorded and we will have the session posted on our website for your reference later on. And before we move forward, as some of you all know, All Raise is a nonprofit dedicated to amplifying female voices, accelerating female success, and creating a tech culture where women are leading, shaping, and funding the future. I want to take a moment to thank our volunteer community and our sponsors for all the work that they do and making events like today possible. They are the key to building and amplifying the movement that will rewire the tech and venture capital industry while creating camaraderie among women and allies as we need to move forward. Thank you again for all of your support. We were so happy to have you on this journey with us. And before I turn it over to Pam and our speakers, please don't forget to get your book, Just Work, Get Shit Done, Fast and Fair. I will be dropping in the promotional code for you all to get on that. And without further ado, Pam, I will hand it over to you.
Thank you, Marion. I'm so excited that everybody could join us today on International Women's Day and that we have these two fabulous women, Kim and Trier, to join us today to celebrate International Women's Day. So both of these women do not need introductions, but I will spend a couple moments giving them their accolades here. So Kim Scott is the author of Just Work, Get Shit Done Fast and Fair, as well as the acclaimed author of Radical Candor, Be a Kick-Ass Boss Without Losing Your Humanity. She is the co-creator of an executive education company and workplace comedy series based on her best-selling book, Radical Candor. Jason Rossoff and Kim co-founded the company Radical Candor to help people cultivate caring and candid relationships at work by implementing a feedback-first culture. She's also been the CEO coach at Dropbox, Qualtrics, Twitter, and other tech companies across Silicon Valley. She was a member of the faculty at Apple University, and before that led AdSense, YouTube, and DoubleClick teams at Google. Early in her career, Kim managed a pediatric clinic in Kosovo and started a diamond cutting factory in Moscow. She lives with her family in Silicon Valley here. Welcome, Kim.
Thank you.
And we are also joined by Trier Bryant. She is co-founder and CEO of JustWorks LLC. She's a strategic executive leader with distinctive tech, Wall Street, and military experience spanning over 15 years. She's previously held leadership roles at Astra, Twitter, Goldman Sachs, and proudly served as a combat veteran in the US Air Force and as a captain leading engineering teams while spearheading diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives for the Air Force Academy, Air Force, and the DoD. Trier advises leading companies like Equinox, Airbnb, SoundCloud, Alto, Rockefeller Foundation, and others on their talent and DEI strategies, and has an unwavering commitment to employees within organizations to create a more equitable, inclusive, and thriving workplace, producing prosperous companies. She's been featured as an influential DEI practitioner across outlets from USA Today to CNN and South by Southwest. So she is an amazing individual as well in her own right. So Trier, welcome as well today. We're excited to have you.
Thanks, Pam.
So Trier and Kim co-founded the company Just Works LLC to help organizations and individuals create more equitable workplaces. And we're here to discuss the amazing book, Just Work, that was created and that kind of founded and kicked off this whole process. It is chock full of interesting frameworks and anecdotes and storytelling, and all of us can relate. It's very intimate, very personal recounting of things that have gone well and things that have not always gone so well in the process, because this is hard stuff that we're dealing with. Hard diversity, equity, inclusion is not easy. And so thank you for writing such a vulnerable and incredible book for us, Kim. One of the things that would be great is maybe just to talk about, you kick off with probably one of the most powerful introductions I've ever read in a book. Lots of times I just skip over the introduction because I'm like, whatever. To all of you who will read this book, start with the introduction. It is one of the most powerful openers to a book that I have ever had. And at Always, we actually believe very strongly in data. And that if we don't shine a light on the problem, that data is a way for us to shine a light on a problem. And if we don't know what the problem is and we're not measuring ourselves, we're not going to be accountable to getting it fixed. And so I wanted to start there because your introduction starts with the statement, we can't fix problems we refuse to notice. And it's been hard to get people to notice diversity, equity, and inclusion. So I thought we would start there. What makes this problem so hard to get noticed, and what can we all do about that?
I think as I was writing that introduction, I wrote this book in some way. It was like therapy for me. It was a way for me to process all of the crap that had happened to me kind of every day in my career that I had mostly been in denial about. I was one of the people who was refusing to notice the problems that were happening to other people and also the problems that were happening to me. I didn't want to think of myself ever as a victim, but even less did I want to think of myself as a perpetrator. So I didn't notice any of it. And so in the course of writing this book, I really tried to create a framework that would, because it feels like such a hairball, the problem of injustice at work, that it's impossible to untangle. And so what I really wanted to do was to try to create a framework that would sort of distinguish, that would parse the problem so that we could fix the problem. And then I gave the book to Trier, which was very exciting because I wanted to see how other people did. Was this only true for me, or did it work for other people, this framework?
Yeah, and then Pam, I got the book and I read the book, and as Oprah says, I had this aha moment. And, reading the book and reflecting in your own stories from your career, and it really just sharpened my perspective of what I had experienced. Kim's superpower, whether it's with Radical Candor or as you'll read in Just Work, is she does this exceptional job of taking these abstract ideas where we know that we've had this experience, we can't quite name it or articulate it, and to give you very concrete, practical frameworks, tools to add as a professional and as leaders that you can use in your everyday life. And so that is what makes, I think, Just Work differentiates itself from other books, but also the fact that as a DE&I practitioner, we need more frameworks, right? There are so many frameworks that people turn to in various disciplines, whether it's in engineering or marketing or product. I mean, I'm not an engineer anymore, but I can speak articulately and intelligently about engineering frameworks that are commonly used. But when we ask, hey, what are the D&I frameworks that we are leveraging to have this sustainable change we need in organizations? There's not a lot of things to point to. And so not to say that this will be the silver bullet for everything, but it's a great starting place. And it just provides everyone very tangible, actionable things to do regardless of your role.
I can't agree more. Having read the book, it is dog-eared, it is underlined. Part of me wants to tell people to do this electronically, and part of me wants to have it as a handbook that you can carry around with you, because there's so much power in this. So because a lot of us haven't had the chance to yet get our fingers on it, what I thought would be great is if you could walk us through a bit of what those frameworks what the framework of the book looks like, so we can get all on the same page about having a common language to have the rest of the conversation today. So I'm going to turn it back over to you to share this framework.
Awesome, thank you. I'm gonna share a deck, because what is a framework without a keynote deck?
So as Kim previously alluded to, workplace injustices get in the way of what we all, quite frankly, just want to do in our roles, in our companies, in our organizations. And it's just that simple desire to do our jobs and to do it well. And so these injustices that occur in the workplace can seem like an intractable issue. But what we're going to do is we're going to highlight a simple framework that breaks it down into specific components so that you can match specific problems and issues with viable solutions so that we can all just work.
So I started writing this book almost as soon as Radical Candor came out, because if you write a book about feedback, you're going to get a lot of it. So here was the kind of feedback I got about Radical Candor. I was giving a presentation at a tech company in San Francisco, and the CEO of the company was a colleague of mine, a former colleague of mine, who I had known for the better part of a decade. And she's also one of too few Black women CEOs in tech. And she pulled me aside after the workshop, and she said, Kim, I love Radical Candor. I think it's going to really help me build the culture that I want. But I got to tell you, it's much harder for me to put it into practice than it is for other people, because as soon as I offer the most gentle, sort of candid criticism, compassionate criticism, I get slimed with the angry Black woman stereotype. And I knew this was true. And I also knew that I had failed to notice it over the course of a decade, the way that a good upstander would have. And moreover, I realized that not only was it true for her, and had I been in denial about it, it was also true for me, and I had been in denial about the things that were happening to me. So that was what really got me to want to think about what are the things that create this environment that prevent us from just work. Because the basic idea of just work is very simple. We all want to work in the kind of environment that is optimized for collaboration. Nobody really wants to be coerced, and most leaders don't want to be coercive leaders. There are a few, but most don't. And we all want to work in the kind of environment in which we can respect one another's individuality. There are very few people who actually want to demand conformity, who actually want a 1984 kind of environment where everybody's in lockstep. So what is it? What gets in the way?
So what we describe as the root causes of workplace injustice. And so what gets in the way is we talk about bias, prejudice, and bullying. So we're going to give some simple definitions to highlight these terms, because a lot of times we lump these different attitudes and behaviors as if they're the same thing, but they're quite different. So bias is not meaning it, prejudice is meaning it, and bullying is just, quite frankly, being mean. And so as Kimberly Crenshaw says, once you can name it, then you can solve for it. And so when you think about this framework and thinking about these different types of problems and how they might have shown up in your own workplace experiences, when we can disentangle them and actually understand the root causes of them, then we know what we can do about it.
So probably like everyone on this call, I experienced bias on the very first day of my very first professional internship. So picture me, it's 1989, I'm working at a bank in Memphis, I'm standing by the elevator, I got my shoulder pads on, I got my wings going on, and an executive at the bank walks up to me and he says, what are you doing here? And I explained that I was in the summer internship program. And he looks at me, kind of cocks his head, and he said, oh, I didn't know they let us hire pretty girls. And this was bias. He did not mean anything by it. He didn't have some deep-seated prejudice against hiring women. In fact, he had started this internship program specifically to try to hire more women. And I knew this man a little bit. He wasn't an asshole. He wasn't trying to be mean to me. But the impact of his words was quite significant. So what could, in an ideal world, what could the leadership at that bank have done so that this moment wouldn't have happened?
Right. So how can an organization, what can they put into place to prevent these from happening? And so what we call them are bias interrupters. And so, yes, there's a lot of organizations that offer unconscious bias training, but actually research shows that doing unconscious bias training without telling people how to change their patterns of behavior can actually be counterproductive. So what we recommend is that organization have shared vocabulary and shared norms when a bias happens so that people are prepared on how to disrupt it. Because we want to disrupt it as soon as it happens to prevent it from perpetuating. So for example, some of them could be a biased alert, right? When everyone says biased alert, you know what that means. One of the things that we've incorporated is purple flag. In my team, we already have a red flag and that means something, yellow flag means something, and now there's a purple flag. So when someone throws a purple flag, you know that there's a biased alert and that there's bias. But what happens after that bias has been interrupted? Then what happens? Because it can feel incredibly uncomfortable for some when you're signaling that bias is being called out. So then what is the norm of how to respond? So the norm could be, hey, thank you for pointing that out. Thanks for flagging it. I apologize. But what happens if you don't understand the bias that was flagged? It's okay to say, hey, I didn't quite catch that. Let's connect after the meeting and we can dig deeper into that or have an additional conversation so that the meeting can go on. Because again, we want to get stuff done fast and fair. And so I know for some of us in certain environments, particularly your proximity to working with people that are different than you, that come from different backgrounds, that identify differently, bias may creep up quite frequently. I've had teams where I could probably throw a purple flag in every meeting. So if we stop in every meeting and then address it at that point, we're not going to get things done. But let's follow up and make it a norm within our organizations to do that after the meeting. So we don't minimize the bias, but we can also, and not ignore the problem, but we can also disrupt it, call it out, and then move forward.
Now, as you can imagine, in 1989 at a bank in Memphis, there was not a system of bias interrupters. So what could I have said, or better yet, what could the guy standing next to me have said to let this guy know that what he had said, that he had kind of stepped in it? And so, of course, at age 18 in 1989, I didn't know what to say. But fast forward 30 some odd years, and now I'm the author of Radical Candor, a book about workplace communication. I'm supposed to know what to say. I still can't think of what to say. And as I'm writing Just Work. And so I put it out there on social media. And a guy who I'm on a board with pulled me aside afterwards and he said, thank you for telling me that story because I know I've done that kind of thing to the women I've worked with. And I'm so glad you explained to me how it landed. And then he said, I'll do you a favor too. I'll tell you what you could have said that would have stopped me in my tracks. What you could have said was, I don't think I can work here when you call me pretty girl because I don't think you'll take me seriously. He said that would have broken my heart and made me realize that I was what I was doing. So what we call this is an I statement. The goal here is to invite people in to understand the situation from your perspective. So you're kind of pulling them close and you're maybe holding up a mirror for them. And usually that is enough to, maybe somebody's a little defensive, but usually that's enough to get them to change their behavior.
No, bias is not meaning it, but unfortunately, not everything is unconscious bias. Sometimes we encounter people who consciously believe in offensive stereotypes and think that that is a truth. I was at an organization once where we were interviewing for another talent leader on the team. And we interviewed candidates all day and then debriefed at the end. One of the candidates that we interviewed was a Black woman who came in and she wore her natural hair out to the interview. At the end of the day, when we debriefed, not only did I think that she was the best candidate, it was very clear from everyone's feedback that she was the top candidate and met and exceeded all of the requirements that we had within the job description. However, during the debrief, the hiring manager said, I'm not quite sure that we're going to actually be able to hire her. So at first, I thought this was bias and not meaning it to dig into it. And so I pressed and said, but why would we not be able to hire her? All of her feedback is incredible. And we all think that she is the best person for the role. And the hiring manager said, well, Trier, we just can't put her in front of the business. Her hair doesn't look like our hair does.
Oh,
yeah. Let me just tell you right now, I was not wearing my natural hair out, which looks like this at the time. I was actually wearing my weave and extensions. So this white woman who said that, oh, our hair looked the same, our hair actually did not. And so this is Prejudice. So this was the hiring manager doubling down and meaning it, right? But what could the organization have in place so that this wouldn't happen, to prevent this from happening? And this is what we call a code of conduct, right? But it's a code of conduct, but what it really is it is something that an organization has that people can hold other employees accountable to, that has something with teeth in it, that lets people know what they can and cannot say or do within an organization, right? So this is harder than bias because people can believe whatever they want, but they can't do whatever they want, and they can't impose their prejudice beliefs on others. So this code of conduct and having something with some teeth in it makes that line very clear to let people know what they can and cannot do. So if this organization would have had a very strong code of conduct, then we could have emphasized the respect for individuals and their work, and prohibit, people from saying things that would be derogatory comments to someone and not valuing that individuality. And also, quite frankly, just focusing on what was needed in the job description, because I assure you nothing in there said anything about hair.
So let's imagine that I was Trier's colleague at the moment, at that time, and I wanted to be an upstander. And let's imagine that the company didn't have a good code of conduct. In that case, what I could have said is, or also what Trier could have said is, it is illegal not to hire someone because of their hair. So an it statement can appeal ideally to a code of conduct. It can also appeal to the law, or it can just appeal to common sense. It is ridiculous not to hire someone because of their hair who's qualified for the job. So an it statement really points out that line between, you can believe whatever you want, but you can't do or say whatever you want. And an it statement lets someone know where that line is. And most of the time, people will stay on the correct side of the line.
So the third is bullying. And this for me was the most profound part of the book. If you would ask me prior to reading this book, Trier, have you ever been bullied in your career? I would say, no. Are you kidding me? Have you met me? Have you worked with me? Like, you come for me, I'm going to come right back for you. But then really thinking about bullying as just being mean, we've all had those encounters in our career where someone was just rude, inappropriate, and just, again, mean, quite frankly, mean. And so how do we prevent that from happening? And this was something that I really had to reflect on, because on the moments that I could call back on being bullied, I'd never stood up for myself, and I had never called anyone out because I couldn't recognize it. I didn't name it in that way. So bullying, one of the instances where I've had is, I was asked to join a tech company, and I was brought in. One of the things I was brought in to do was to build their first diversity recruiting team. Now, in a lot of organizations, some of the employee resource groups may own some budget and responsibility to go to conferences and different events for underrepresented professionals to increase recruitment of those groups. Well, when I came in and built that team, it brought in and it solidified a lot of the budgets and responsibilities to the diversity recruiting team. But the lead for the women's engineering employee resource group at this company was not happy about that. And so she was very displeased about that, and went and bullied myself and my team in multiple different ways. One particular instance that stands out is after we came back from Grace Hopper, where we had gotten accolades from the CEO of this company because we had hired more women from Grace Hopper than any other year, and just had such a great footprint at the conference. But even though we did so well, I always encourage my team, whatever small area that we can improve on, we should focus on that. And so when we came back after the conference and we debriefed, this engineering leader of the Women's Employee Resource Group, she came to the meeting, but she also brought 5 other women to provide bad feedback on the experience and my team, but they didn't even go to the conference. And it wasn't until after the debrief that my team came and said, Trier, that wasn't even fair because these women didn't even go to the conference. Why were they at the debrief? So that is just, high level, quick example of bullying and just being mean. But again, what can an organization do to prevent this harm from happening within our organization? And so what we call out here are consequences. And not just any type of consequences, but there's 3 types of consequences to think about: conversation, compensation, and career. So conversation consequences are, if a bully is bullying, how do you remove that platform? How do you remove the conversational platform that they have so that they don't have the platform to bully other people that they may work with? The second is compensation. We've all seen this happen where there's a bully in the organization. Sometimes they're the brilliant jerk. We know that they're a high performer. We know that they get a lot done, but they leave a trail of harmed individuals within the organization. But then why are we bonusing them? Why are we still increasing their base salary? So let's impact and have consequences on their compensation. And then the last one is career. And this could be not promoting the individual, not giving them larger scope of responsibility, definitely not allowing them to manage and lead a team. But it could also be a career consequence that if we can't get that behavior under control, then you can exit them from the organization, which we know is difficult, but this is where leaders really have to intervene and do and implement these things to prevent this from happening and occurring in their organization.
So let's imagine that at this particular tech company, there weren't consequences for bullying, which is often true at tech companies. So what could I have done if I was on Trier's team? What could I have done to be a good upstander? Or what are the phrases that Trier could have used to create kind of a consequence for bullying? This is what we think of as a use statement. So what I would like to think I would have said if I were on Trier's team at that time is, you weren't even at the conference. You can't give feedback on what went well or went badly. You're just sort of bringing in a mob here of people who weren't there. My daughter explained this to me, the importance of a use statement in the face of bullying. She was getting bullied in school, and she was only in 3rd grade. And I was trying to tell her to use an I statement. I was sort of like saying, well, why don't you tell him, when you do this to me, I feel really sad. And she kind of banged her fist on the table and she said, Mom, he is trying to make me feel sad. Telling him he succeeded is like giving him a cookie. Why would I do that? And I thought, gosh, why would you do that? That's really an important lesson for my book. So use that use statement. The difference between an I statement invites someone in, an it statement shows someone where the boundary is, and a use statement pushes someone away and puts yourself not in the submissive role. Now you're making that other person answer the questions. So these are some of the sort of root causes of workplace injustice. But what happens when we layer power on top of bias, prejudice, and bullying?
Yeah. So first, let's name the problems so leaders can make sure that power doesn't corrupt their teams and their organizations. So when we introduce power into bias or prejudice, we get discrimination. When we introduce power with bullying, that turns into harassment. And then when we introduce power with touch, that's a physical violation. And so going back to the story, the Prejudice story, where the woman, the hiring manager was questioning, hey, can we put this person in front of the business with them wearing their natural hair? Well, we did not end up hiring that person. So the hiring manager had the power to make that decision, made the decision not to hire. And so that was discriminatory. It was a discriminatory act. And so not only is it discrimination, but to let people know how frequently this actually happens. For those of you who are not familiar, California was actually the first state to pass legislation, the Crown Act, that makes it illegal to discriminate against someone by how they wear their hair. Several other states have followed, but this just lets you know actually how, unfortunately, common this has been in the past and hopefully will not be moving forward.
So what are the things that we can do that leaders can do to make sure that discrimination doesn't happen on their teams? This is where bias quantifiers come in. You need to, Pam was talking earlier about the passion that you all feel for measurement. This is where you've got to measure at each stage of the employee life cycle, at hiring, but also at compensation, et cetera. What is going on, and when one group of people is getting underrepresented, you've got to dig in and understand. You've got to go and look for the way that bias and prejudice are impacting the way that you manage.
And Kim, isn't it so interesting how leaders especially in the tech industry, will say, we're data driven,
Yeah.
but how reluctant organizations and leaders are to actually measure what matters when it comes to bias. So if you're data driven with all of your other disciplines, let's get data driven when it comes to workplace injustice as well, so that we understand what's going on so that we can solve it.
Absolutely.
So harassment. So bullying plus power, this is where harassment comes into play. So again, this senior leader that was over the women's employee resource group that was previously responsible for Grace Hopper, she was more senior than me, and she did attempts to actually get me fired over this, and it's pretty funny now. Get me fired over this and take the budget and have this new team removed, right? So again, what can we do so that this doesn't occur in organizations? Because power can corrupt. So how do we put checks and balances in place? How do we put checks and balances in place to prevent this from happening, so that there's no unilateral authority, right? So no one person can control a budget or a strategy or who's get hired, who gets promoted, our mentoring systems. Everything should have checks and balances to hold people accountable, so multiple people can ask questions and intervene in case something attempts or someone tries to go astray.
So what about physical violations? These occur when someone either is bigger than me, which is almost always the case. I'm like 5 feet tall, or when they have positional power over me. So kind of a mild example of there's some stronger ones in the book, but a mild example, I was giving a presentation about how to be a better boss to a particular leader's team. And it was in front of about 500 people. And this leader had a reputation for not really appreciating the value that women on his team were bringing. So I had a feeling it was going to be a little awkward. So two colleagues of mine and I are on stage with this particular leader. And he introduces the first one, and my first colleague, and he shakes his hand. He introduces my second colleague, and he shakes his hand. And then he introduces me, and he makes this like weird low bow, grabs my hand and kisses it, and like basically licks on it. It was like all I could do not to rub it off on my sweater. And so this was like a very simple physical violation. And the solution to a physical violation is to have a culture of consent, to make sure that even for the most benign of touches, like a handshake, everyone knows that it is the toucher's responsibility to know whether or not the touchy wants to be touched. And if they don't touch. It's really not that complicated. And then there needed to be trusted reporting systems. I had nowhere to go to sort of tell. I tried to tell him directly, and he's like, "Oh, surely you don't want me to treat you like a man." I was like, "Actually, that would have been fine. Just shake my hand." But there was nobody. HR wasn't interested in hearing. So there needs to be a way at every company where you can report these. And if you start with the small things, the bigger problems are less likely to happen.
And one thing to highlight with the trusted reporting systems is that, especially for leaders, right, we should also take a hard look to make sure that our executives have trusted reporting systems. Sometimes we focus a lot on making sure that our teams and our organizations have it, but then there's a missing layer of that reporting system at the executive level, right? When you're reporting to the CEO or you are responsible for the people function, what does a trusted reporting system look like for that individual? And to have those conversations beforehand before something occurs.
So this is a lot: bias, prejudice, bullying, discrimination, harassment, and physical violations. These problems are not intractable. When we all work together and we understand the role that we can play, these are all problems that we can solve in the workplace. One of my favorite stories comes from Alan Eustace, one of my favorite tech leaders in Silicon Valley. Used to stand up in front of his team. He had a big tech team, and he would say, "Okay, I want everyone who's underrepresented on the team to raise their hand if they have experienced some sort of bias or prejudice or worse in the last week. Not in your whole career, in the last week," meaning it's happened on this team. And 100% of the underrepresented people on his team raised their hand. And then he said, "Okay, for everyone else, if you have expressed bias or prejudice on this in a meeting in the last week, I want you to raise your hand." 0% of the people raised their hand. This goes back to Pam, what you were saying, you can't fix what you refuse to notice. So if everyone plays their role, we can begin to notice these things when they go wrong.
So everyone does have a role. So the first role is a person harmed. And what we should really call out here is, from our perspective, this is really the only role where you get to choose a response, right? So you have a choice, because if you've been the person harmed, I can acknowledge this. There are moments where in that moment, I don't have the energy and maybe sometimes the courage to confront or call someone out or to have a response, right? However, there's a difference though of me not choosing response because I don't know what to say versus I know what to say, but I'm just choosing not to right now in this moment. And so what we really want to empower folks to do is to end the default to silence. If you choose not to respond because that's your choice, that's fine. But let's not default to silence because we don't know what to do, right?
Now, sometimes you are the upstander. You observe what something has gone wrong, and you don't want to be the silent bystander. There's been so much written about how silent bystanders reflect and reinforce bias instead of intervening. So here you have less of a choice. You must intervene, but there's a lot of different ways you can intervene. At the very least, you can pull that person aside who is harmed afterwards, and you can say, I noticed what happened. I'm so sorry. Can I help? There's more direct ways to do it as well. Now, sometimes, and this, I think, at least for me, is the most uncomfortable of the roles. Sometimes all of us play the role of the person who caused harm. We say something biased, and sometimes we do worse. So what is our obligation there? The obligation is to listen and address. And one of the things I really try hard to do in this book is it tells a lot of stories about when I was the one who caused harm, because I want to normalize you can't do right if you can't admit what you've done wrong. And we need to get used to admitting when we've screwed up.
And then finally, leaders. And leaders have to intervene to prevent. They have to prevent these workplace injustices from occurring. Now, that doesn't mean that putting all of these systems in place and solutioning is not going to, we're human, right? So we're still going, there are folks that are still going to falter, but we have to do everything to prevent. And if those workplace injustices do occur, then how do we respond accordingly to make sure that we're continuing to build and cultivate trusted cultures where we do optimize for collaboration and then also respecting our individuality as well. So whatever your role is in whatever situation and scenario, we just hope you don't default to silence anymore in the face of these injustices. Because when we can name the problem, then we can all work together to solve them and create the kind of environment where we can all just work. And also, if you haven't caught it, because no one catches this until after they read the book, it's so funny how Kim calls this out, but just work is really cut the shit, really, let's just work, but it's also just work. So.
Thank you all so much. We'd love to stop talking and start listening, hear your all stories and hear what you have to say.
Thank you. I mean, sharing that framework I've read the book. There's so much more detail and substance in the book, but that was such a great framework for us. And that last point that you made about the 4 roles, and, as I read the book, how many times did I realize my role in each one of those 4 roles? You unfortunately, none of us is just one of those roles, or fortunately, I guess one of us is not, because that's how we're going to create change. And so one of the things that you do a good job calling out in the book is about this compassion for ourselves. So can you just unpack that a little bit? Because I think it's such a hard topic, and there's, why does everybody, I can be a victim, but I'm not going to raise my hand and say I'm the perpetrator, or, I'm a survivor of this, or I'm the person harmed, but I'm not going to say that I actually perpetuated the harm. And you do such a great job of being so open and vulnerable about that in the book, but creating that passionate space, I think, is really important. So could you comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the easiest way to answer that is with an explanation about a moment where I really screwed up and didn't play the role of leader. but I understand why I didn't. I can forgive myself, and luckily the guy that I hurt can forgive me too. But so I had just gotten this new guy on my team, and I was working at a big tech company, and he was new to California, new to the environment, and he had a habit of referring to women as girls. And this always pisses me off when this happens, but it's also a conversation I've had so many times in my career, and I'm sick of it. I was sick of it then. I'm even more sick of it now. Like, why do I have to explain this to you over and over and over again? And also it's a new relationship, and he suspected had different politics than I do, so I wasn't looking forward to that conversation. And so I responded as though he was calling me a girl, and I had a choice not to say anything, and I chose not to say anything. But I was not the person harmed in this case. The people on his team were the people harmed, and it was my job, for their sake, to tell him, but also for his sake, it was my job to tell him. One of the things that happened was a couple of weeks later, I introduced him to my boss, and he went in to have a meeting with my boss. And I still hadn't had this conversation with him. And I thought I was doing him this favor to set him up with this powerful person at the company. And he walks in and he refers to a woman on his team as girl. And for the next 20 minutes, all he heard about was what the problem was. And he came into my office later and he was kind of pale and shaken. And it's strange how we do to others what has been done to us. He told us this thing. And I said to him, the kind of thing that people have said to me a million times and that always pisses me off. I said, oh, it's no big deal. And to his credit, he said, I would say when your boss's boss, the first time you meet her, yells at you for 20 minutes, it is a big deal. Of course it was a big deal. And then I still am not admitting that I did something wrong. I looked at the other two guys who were sitting in my office with me, whom I had the conversation with. And I said, you all can just thank me now for having warned you. And this new guy on the team was like, why didn't you tell me? Why did you tell them and not me? And so it was really, now I'm finally beginning to get the picture that I had screwed up. But it was really one of those moments where I realized that we're used to playing one role, but suddenly we find ourselves in a different role, and it's unclear how to be and what to do.
I think that's so, like, you're so vulnerable, and by all of us being vulnerable, one of the points that you're both making here is that by all of us being vulnerable and being willing to own up to the moment and stand up in the moment, that's how we're going to fix this. So I think this is really great. One of the things that, as I was reading the book, I was like, oh, this is so great. I have my I statements, I have my it statements, I have my you statements. I'm empowered. And yet in the moment, maybe I want to say something, but I am now at a loss for words. Out goes my I, my it, my you. Like, how can we begin to practice this in or create an environment where it's easier for us to do this? Because I suspect it's like any communication muscle we have. And yet we're not used to having these kind of more honest, direct, frank conversations. So what kind of guidance, and Trier, I'm sure you have some thoughts on this.
Yeah, it's a great question, because you're reading this and you're like, oh yeah, that situation was this, and I should have said this, and hindsight is 2020. But that's okay. And the point is that in that moment, is it bias? Is it prejudice? You might respond with an I statement and then look back and say, wow, that was really prejudice. It should be an it statement. But the point is that we're thinking about it, and that we are building that muscle and just saying, hey, when I do find myself in these situations, that I do feel more comfortable to respond. One of the things that we recommend, and even on the website, there's a place where you can go and share your story. We need to start telling these stories more and being vulnerable. There are so many stories in Kim's book where I was like, okay, I wasn't the only one that experienced that. It wasn't me. It wasn't that person. Like, this is happening. And so that we can find those shared experiences, and then to say, there are similar experiences that Kim and I have had where Kim said, well, I said this. And I was like, I didn't think to say that. And then there are experiences that I had, were like, oh yeah, well, I said this. And she was like, why didn't I think of that? And so leaning on each other. And the other part is that it's not just as a person who may have been harmed, but to your point, Pam, owning that we've been in all of these different roles and talking about those things. So, I've really had to reflect and own as a leader where I didn't prevent, where I didn't provide consequences for the bullies in the organization? And how did, we talk through and justify that through, well, this is a direct culture, right? Acknowledging those missteps and sharing and having those dialogues with leaders so that we can get better.
It's funny. My great grandmother was a very strong woman who raised 4 girls on her own. And when they turned, I think, 12, she needle pointed each of them a pillow that said, "Say something, you can always take it back." And for me, this is very helpful because it liberates me. I may not say just exactly the right thing. And also, I may think it's bias, but maybe then I'm going to find out it's prejudice or bullying, but that's okay. I'm at least gathering more information, or maybe I respond as though it's bullying and I'm sort of attacking someone. I'm escalating too fast. But that's also okay because I'm giving that person some feedback that this is how what you said landed for me. And so I think we just all need to cut ourselves some slack. We don't have to know exactly what's going on, and we don't have to have the perfect response, but we just need to respond, if possible, if we choose to.
You do create grace and space in the book for that. Like, you always have choice and agency to say, like, it isn't your job every time to respond or react, that you can have, you have choice in the process. There's a couple questions coming in about what can people do when a company or individual uses the legal system as a tool in this case, bullying was specifically said, like sending somebody a threatening cease and desist letter to a high performing employee when she or he leaves. Like, any comments on this in terms of when legal gets brought in? Because we've all seen this play out in the press too.
Yeah, I think that one of the things that we've seen a lot of lately is the way in which people who are prone to bullying weaponize the legal system for their own purposes. And I think one of the things that I really admire about what is happening right now, and one of the things that makes me optimistic, is that yes, people can go and they can use the legal system for their own purposes, but there's also a possibility of going public with your story, of telling your story publicly. And that all of a sudden makes weaponizing the legal system a little bit more risky for companies. Also, I would say there's another thing that makes me optimistic is the move that I think right now is being led by Ifeoma formerly from Pinterest, to make the use of NDAs, of weaponized NDAs, illegal. And I'm optimistic that she's going to succeed in this. And that's going to go a long way, because I think the system of using NDAs to silence people who are victims of injustice in the workplace is really corrupt. There's Ifeoma. She's here.
Another thing to take into consideration, and I think this is me definitely wearing my chief people officer hat, I think that when you're assessing the organization that you're going into, if you're interviewing, and then also as leaders, what type of people HR function do you want to have? I've had leaders that have said, Trier, we're looking for a people leader, like you should come and join us. And one of the first questions I ask is, what do you feel is the role of the people leader? And usually there's 2 types of answers. There are leaders that say, oh, well, the people function is there to protect the company. And then there's other people that feel that the people function is there to protect the people. And in organizations where the people function is there to protect the people, I find that those are the organizations that are not going to get in these type of combative situations with employees by bringing in like a cease and desist letter, right? Like, we can communicate, talk through this, and whatever situations, like, we should have the professionals able to, address that. However, if that does occur, if an organization is bringing a cease and desist and they're taking a legal action, you should absolutely get legal counsel. Do not feel that like, oh, well, I'm senior enough or this or that, I've experienced enough to handle that. When legal professionals are involved, then you should protect yourself and have legal representation as well.
Thanks for that shout out, for the new legislation that's being passed. Time's Up has a legal defense fund as well, if you aren't aware of it and can't afford your own legal representation. So just wanted to give a shout out. You can visit their social media pages or their website and get access to the information that you need there. Pivoting just a little bit from this conversation, it'd be, we're increasingly a society of polarized positions, people digging in on opposite ends of the spectrum. And when it comes to prejudice and bullying, you have some interesting frameworks that you use in the book. And you make a statement about your First Amendment rights are political rights, not workplace rights. And as a leader, you're overstepping to try to control what people believe, but they're free to believe whatever they want, but they're not free to do whatever they want. And I think, whether you're in a leadership position or not, this is an important statement kind of to unpack, especially as we see this playing out in the press, in conversations that are happening. We see it with the Expensify controversy about can you contact a customer base and tell them to go out and vote, or Brian Armstrong over at Coinbase. We see this playing out. And so I think we'd be remiss in this opportunity to not tap both of you to think about and give us your thoughts and opinions on this.
Yeah, so I would say, not only are you not free in the workplace to do whatever you want, you're also not free to say whatever you want. If you're going to say things that make it impossible for a team to collaborate, you can't do it. It is a leader's role to optimize for collaboration and to make sure that people are being respectful. And so I really feel very strongly that it is so important in the workplace to be clear about the kinds of things that you can't say or do at work, that you could say or do in a public square, but the workplace is not a public square.
Yeah, so this is interesting because Kim and I, we have these debates and we discuss these things. I have a different perspective, right? I think that for me as a Black woman, racism isn't what scares me, it's the denial of racism that scares me. And so when I onboarded Expensify at one of my last companies. And so when I got that email, I was like, this is great. Didn't we make a good choice of the product, right? And when I heard about what happened at Coinbase, that was a data point that I needed to make decisions on what products I may use, right, when it comes to cryptocurrency. So I think that for me personally, I want to know where leaders stand. I want to know where organizations stand, but you have to be intentional with that and you have to be thoughtful. So I know, like when I was at Twitter, if anyone's familiar with Twitter's values, one of Twitter's values is communicate fearlessly. Now, I think that when they intended to make those values, they were probably talking about the platform, but employees hang on to that. And you'll be in meetings and people will just say the most outrageous things and then say, but I'm communicating fearlessly. And so, as a people team, we had to make sure that we had code of conducts and things in place to say, okay, we want people to feel empowered to communicate fearlessly, but there's other restraints there to protect our employees so that everyone can have an inclusive experience. So I think that companies can be intentional. They can have a position, they can take a position, but you have to be thoughtful and you have to be, strategic in that decision, just the way that we are in everything else that you do when it comes to your organization.
Yeah, totally agree with what Trier said there. We do have some disagreements, but at a high level, we totally agree that it is good. Not only is it okay, but I think it's good when leaders are free to say, go vote. I think I admire the CEO of Expensify for doing that. And but I think the important thing is that leaders create a culture of debate and that they disallow the kind of language that shuts debate down. So you can say, go vote, but you're not allowed to use racial epithets in the workplace, for example.
Thank you. And I think we have time for one more question. So this one's going to get into it as well. The question is, what can you do when women are tearing down or putting down other women on the job? and you feel that you can't bring it up with your male bosses because it feels like it's coming across as girl drama, mean girl, like cat fighting. And, we see this being perpetuated in multiple ways, even in the media today. So I'm just curious, maybe you have some advice to unpack around how we can avoid some of the stereotypes emerging as we're trying to create a just work environment.
Well, my first answer to that is, so one, I have been a fan of Radical Candor before I was even introduced and met Kim Scott, right? So I was definitely kind of fangirling when we first met. But to me, having professionally grown up in the military, where there is such a sense of camaraderie for those smaller underrepresented populations, whether it was women who were officers in the Air Force or Black officers that were in the Air Force, there is this close camaraderie. And so when I left the military, to see that type of tearing down in the workplace was a new for me. When I went to Goldman and then also transitioning into tech. But my thing is, one, let's have radical candor with each other, right? Like, let's give each other the feedback so we can grow and that we can all do our best work, and there's room at the top for all of us. And so I think that the more that we understand that we can all achieve whatever it is we want to achieve, and we'll get there quicker if we help each other. And for those who don't understand it, I just say that there is a special place for those women. But what you focus on magnifies. And so I focus on building the relationships with women who do want to uplift and who do want to support. And there are so many women out there that those positive women drown out the women that are just getting caught up in the noise. But radical candor, and there's room at the top for all of us. So let's all just be exceptional and run the world.
Yes. Amen to that. I also think it's really important to understand how systems sometimes pit us against each other and how men sometimes pit us against each other. I worked for a guy once who was always, he had this sort of, he was gross. I don't know another word for it, but he liked to create what he called a cat fight. And he would work really hard to do it. And luckily, at a certain point, the women who worked for him recognized what he was doing, and we banded together and we said, this is bullshit. You're not doing, you cannot pit us against one another. But it is really important. Some people are extremely manipulative and very good at creating that kind of infighting between women. And then the other thing that happens often is when there should be room at the top for everyone, but there's a leader who's like, I'm only going to have one person, one woman, one person. And then that creates a giant incentive for that one person to keep other people away. And so we've got to make sure that we fight that when we see it, and that we fight it together. We don't get sucked into that kind of nonsense.
I think that's such a beautiful statement on which to end today's session, because it is International Women's Day, and at All Raised, we also believe in the pay it forward mentality and the responsibility that each of us has to create more space at the table for women and underrepresented, underestimated individuals. So I think that's a beautiful note on which to conclude this. I want to thank you so much for both joining us, Kim and Trier, today, and being vulnerable and honest in sharing your opinions. The book is amazing. And so if you haven't yet, if you're still with us and haven't yet seen the link to go get the book, please do so. And we will make this, there's a couple of comments here from everybody asking if we'll share this. So we will share this framework. We will share this recording out for people. I want to thank both of you for being here today and providing such a great framework for us all to have these conversations moving forward.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. And everybody should also retweet the link that Ifeoma put in. We need to help her be successful on this because it's vital.
Absolutely. Thank you both. And thanks everybody for joining us today.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you. Happy International Women's Day.
Have a good one. Take care.